The child's breathing had turned wrong sometime after midnight. Helen Easton knew the sound of wrong breathing the way she knew the sound of a hammer pulled back on a revolver instantly, in the gut, with no room for doubt. She had been sitting beside the narrow cot in the back room of the Dusty Creek Saloon for 6 hours already, her palm pressed against her daughter's forehead, and the heat radiating off that small face was the most terrifying thing she had ever felt. More terrifying than the men who had come for her. More terrifying than the secrets she carried in her chest like loaded ammunition. More terrifying than the betrayal that had brought her to this raw, unforgiving town in the first place. "Clara," she whispered, "stay with me, sweetheart. You stay with me." The little girl did not answer. She was 7 years old and she had her mother's dark eyes and her dead father's stubborn jaw, and right now she lay with her lips slightly parted, her small chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid pulls that made Helen's own lungs ache in sympathy. The door opened. Helen's hand moved to the handle of the Colt single-action Army revolver at her hip before she even turned her head. It was a reflex drilled into her by 3 years of living on the wrong side of desperate men, and she was not ashamed of it. She was ashamed of many things, but not that. The man who stepped through the door was tall, broad in the shoulder, and wearing the kind of expression that told her immediately he had not expected to find a woman with a gun aimed at his chest when he came to check on the noise. His name was Joseph Donnelly. She did not know that yet. "Easy," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had been trained by years of not wanting to startle anything that might run or bite or shoot back. "I'm not armed. I heard the child. I came to see if there was something I could do." Helen kept the gun level. "Who are you?" "Joseph Donnelly. I ride for the Brackman Ranch 8 miles east." He kept his hands visible, fingers spread wide, and he didn't look at the gun. He looked at the child. And something in his face when he looked at Clara, a shadow crossing those steady gray eyes, something that looked achingly close to grief and recognition and fear all at once made Helen's finger ease off the trigger. "She's burning up," Helen said. It was not a request for help. It was simply a fact escaping her mouth because she had been holding it inside alone for too long. "I can see that," Joseph said quietly. "How long has the fever been this high?" "Since sundown." He moved closer slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him. She didn't stop him. He knelt beside the cot and studied Clara's face, and then he pressed the back of his fingers against her cheek with a gentleness so unexpected from a man his size that Helen felt something crack open in her chest that she could not afford to have cracked open. "I'm going to ride for Doc Haskell," he said. "He's 12 miles south, but he's the only real doctor in 3 counties. It's past midnight. Then I'd better ride fast." He was on his feet and moving toward the door before Helen could organize a response. She watched him, this stranger with gentle hands and gray eyes that had looked at her daughter like she mattered, and she said the only thing she could manage. "Why?" He paused with his hand on the door frame and looked back at her. In the low orange light of the kerosene lamp he looked like something carved from the landscape itself, solid and weathered and real. "Because no child should burn alone in the dark," he said, "and no mother should either." Then he was gone, and Helen heard the thunder of hooves fading south into the Arizona night of 1882, and she turned back to her daughter and pressed her lips against that too-hot forehead and made herself breathe. She had not asked for a guardian. She had not asked for kindness. She had spent the last 3 years making certain she did not need either. But as she held her daughter's hand and listened to the terrible, shallow breathing, she found herself doing something she had not done in a very long time. She hoped. She had arrived in Dusty Creek, Arizona territory, 4 days earlier on the southbound stage from Tucson, and she had not intended to stay longer than a night. That had been her method since she left Missouri in the spring of 1879. Move quickly, stay briefly, leave no trace that a woman traveling alone with a small child had passed through. Because the man she was running from was methodical and patient, and he had friends in every town between Kansas City and the California coast. His name was Roland Voss, and he was not her husband, although he had very much wanted to be. Roland Voss was a land speculator with a habit of violence and a face that the territorial newspapers described as distinguished. He had made his fortune buying claims at gunpoint and selling water rights to desperate farmers, and he had decided, 2 years after Helen's husband Thomas Easton died of a rattlesnake bite outside of Abilene, that Helen and her daughter and the 240 acres Thomas had left them in probate were all things that rightfully belonged to him. Thomas had been a good man. Not an exciting man, not a passionate man, but a steady and decent one. And Helen had loved him the way you love a warm fire on a cold evening, gratefully and without complication. She had been 22 when they married. She had been 25 when he died. She had been 26 when Roland Voss showed up at her door with papers that she could not quite read properly because Thomas had been the reader in the family, and she had made the mistake of letting Voss across her threshold before she understood what he wanted. She understood it very quickly after that. She understood it when he grabbed her wrist and told her she would sign those papers one way or another. She understood it when she looked at Clara, 4 years old and holding a corn-husk doll in the doorway, and made the fastest decision of her life. She had hit Roland Voss with a cast-iron skillet, taken the $60 from the tin box above the fireplace, saddled the horse, put Clara in front of her, and ridden west before sundown. That had been the beginning of her dark past, or the continuation of it, depending on where you started counting. The gun came 6 months later in a trading post outside of Santa Fe when she used the last of her money to buy the Colt from a widow who needed to eat. A traveling scout named McCready had spent 3 weeks teaching her to shoot it properly in exchange for mending work, and by the time she reached Albuquerque, she was better with it than most men she met, which was partly luck and partly the particular focused desperation that comes from having a 7-year-old depending on you not to miss. She had taken work where she could find it. Laundry, mostly. Some cooking. One season as a seamstress for a dress shop in El Paso, where the owner was fair, and the pay was steady, and Clara had gone to a proper school for 4 months, which had been the happiest 4 months of their running years. Then the letter had arrived, a letter that looked like it was from a cousin back east, but was actually a warning from a sympathetic neighbor in Abilene. And Helen had packed them up again and moved south and west, always further from the flat Kansas plains where Roland Voss had eyes in every courthouse. She had never intended to be a woman who carried a gun. She had never intended to be a woman who moved through the night with her daughter on the back of a borrowed horse, reading the shadows for shapes that meant danger. She had wanted a garden. She had wanted a kitchen with a proper stove, and a school within walking distance and Sunday mornings, without the particular electric terror of wondering whether this was the town where she finally got caught. But intention and life were 2 different countries, and she had long since stopped confusing the map for the territory. Dusty Creek had been a necessary stop because Clara had developed a cough on the road from Bisbee, and Helen had told herself she would stay only long enough for the cough to clear. The saloon keeper, a heavy-set widow named Mee Colton, had offered her the back room in exchange for kitchen help, and Helen had accepted because the room had a lock on the door and 2 windows that faced different directions, and those were her primary criteria for shelter. She had not expected the cough to become a fever. She had not expected the fever to climb so fast and so high. She had not expected a stranger to come through the door at midnight and look at her daughter like she was worth saving. She had certainly not expected him to come back. But just after 3 in the morning, as the lamp burned low and Helen's prayers had turned from words into something wordless and raw, she heard hoofbeats again, and then voices. And then the door opened and Joseph Donnelly came back with a small, white-haired man carrying a leather bag and wearing a nightshirt tucked hastily into his trousers. Dr. Walter Haskell had been practicing medicine in the Arizona Territory since 1871, and he had the hands and eyes of a man who had seen most of what frontier life could produce. He examined Clara thoroughly, quietly, and without drama, and when he finally looked up at Helen, he said, "Scarlet fever, early stage. She's strong and you caught it early. Keep her cool, keep her drinking water if you can get it into her, and pray the fever breaks before morning." "And if it doesn't break before morning?" Helen asked. He met her eyes with the direct honesty of a man who respected her enough not to soften the truth. "Then we'll have harder decisions to make." He left a bottle of laudanum for the pain, and a packet of powdered willow bark for the fever, and a second bottle of something he called fever drops that he said he'd had from a Mexican healer in Nogales, and that worked better than anything he'd mixed himself, though he couldn't entirely explain why. Then he took the money Helen pressed into his palm without counting it, gave her a long, steady look, and said, "You're doing everything right, Mrs. Easton. Don't let yourself believe otherwise." And then it was just Helen and Clara and Joseph Donnelly, and the long dark hours between 3 in the morning and dawn. She expected him to leave. A man who had already ridden 24 miles in the dead of night to fetch a doctor had done more than his share. He had no obligation to stay. He barely knew her name. He sat down in the chair on the other side of the cot, pulled his hat off, and set it on his knee. "You don't have to stay," Helen told him. "I know," he said. She looked at him properly for the first time. She had been too frightened for Clara, too tightly wound around her own fear, to really see him before now. He was, she estimated, in his mid-30s, perhaps 34 or 35, with the particular combination of weathering and steadiness that the frontier put into some men and broke out of others. His hair was dark brown going gray at the temples. His jaw was heavy with 2 days of beard. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who worked scarred and calloused and strong, but they had been gentle on her daughter's cheek, and that fact had lodged itself somewhere in her chest and would not move. "What happened to you?" she asked, because she was too tired for careful conversation and because something about him suggested a hidden motive she had not yet identified. In her experience, men who did extraordinary kindnesses in the middle of the night were either very good or working an angle she couldn't see yet. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had a daughter." Helen went very still. "Her name was Alice," he said. "She was 4 years old. It was the summer of 1878. Fever took her in 3 days. He paused. "I was away on a cattle drive when she got sick. My wife, her name was Nora, she sent word, but it didn't reach me for 5 days. Alice was already buried by the time I got back." The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. "I'm sorry," Helen said, and meant it with everything she had. "I swore after that," he said, "that if I ever had the chance to sit with a child through a fever, I would sit with them all the way through." He looked at Clara. "That's all. There's no angle to it. I just can't leave." Helen believed him. She did not know why she believed him so completely and so quickly when she had learned over 3 years to trust almost no one. But she believed him the way you believe a compass, not because you chose to, but because it pointed true and your bones knew the difference. "Her name is Clara," Helen said. "She is 7 years old. She likes drawing horses, and she can already read better than most adults I've met, and she has never once in her life had a fever this bad." "Tell me more about her," Joseph said. And so Helen talked. She talked about Clara learning to walk on a dirt floor in Kansas, and about the way Clara had laughed on the back of the horse when they first rode west, laughed like it was an adventure and not a desperate flight, because children have the mercy of not knowing the difference until too late. She talked about Clara's drawings, which she kept in a rolled cloth tucked inside her traveling bag, and about how Clara had once spent an entire afternoon naming every single cloud she could see from a hilltop outside of Albuquerque. She talked about the corn husk doll Clara still slept with even though she was getting older, the one she'd had since before Thomas died, the one she called Miss Penny for no reason anyone could determine. And Joseph listened. He listened with the full, unhurried attention of a man who understood that what he was being given was not simply information but trust, and that trust in this particular woman had been very dearly purchased. Somewhere in there, Helen changed Clara's cool cloth. Somewhere in there, Joseph got up and brought a fresh bucket of water from the pump in the back courtyard without being asked. Somewhere in there, the moon moved, and the coyotes outside stopped their distant commentary, and the saloon above them went completely quiet as the last drinkers stumbled home. And somewhere in there, Helen started asking him questions back. She learned that Joseph Donnelly had grown up in County Clare, Ireland, and come to America at 17 with his uncle and two cousins, following the lean years of the 1860s. She learned that he had driven cattle up from Texas to Kansas 3 times before he turned 25, and that he had ridden briefly as a deputy marshal in New Mexico in 1875, which explained the particular quality of stillness he wore like a coat. She learned that he had married Nora Keenan in 1873, and that they had been happy, genuinely and uncomplicated happy, until Alice died, and then Nora died 8 months later of a grief that wore itself as pneumonia, and that Joseph had never quite convinced himself was only coincidence. She learned that he had been working the Brackman Ranch for 3 years, which was long enough to be trusted but not long enough to have put down roots, and that he lived in the bunkhouse with 4 other men, and that the thing he missed most about having a home was the sound of someone else breathing in the dark. He said that last part very quietly, as if he had not entirely meant to say it out loud, and then he looked at his hat and turned it twice in his hands and did not look up for a moment. Helen looked at his face in the lamplight and felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. It was the feeling of wanting to reach across a space toward another person. Not need, not strategy, not the careful calculation of whom to trust and how far, just wanting. Simple, terrifying, forbidden wanting. She pushed it down. She had a daughter burning with fever and a man from Missouri hunting her, and she was in a town she had not planned to stay in, and she was not, she told herself firmly, in any position to want anything from anyone. Just past 5 in the morning, Clara opened her eyes. Helen was there instantly, on her knees beside the cot, her hands around her daughter's face. "Clara, Clara, I'm here." Clara looked at her and then past her at Joseph, with the slightly unfocused interest of a child coming up from deep water. "Who is that man?" she asked. Her voice was rough and small. "His name is Mr. Donnelly," Helen said. "He's been helping us." Clara studied him with her father's stubborn eyes. "He's big," she decided. "That's true," Joseph agreed gravely. "Are you a cowboy?" "I work with cattle," he said. "Some people call that a cowboy, yes." "My mama has a gun," Clara informed him. "I noticed that," he said, and something around his eyes moved that was almost a smile. Clara turned back to Helen and reached up to touch her cheek with one small, too warm hand. "I'm thirsty, Mama." Helen poured water with hands that shook. She was not a woman who shook easily, and she resented the shaking, but there was nothing to be done about it. She helped Clara drink, and the child drank slowly and then lay back and closed her eyes again, and Helen pressed her palm to Clara's forehead and found it still hot but different. Less volcanic, less like a coal fire and more like sun-baked stone. She looked up at Joseph across the cot and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. He nodded, very slightly, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has just been given permission to let it out. An hour later, as the first gray light of dawn began to press against the 2 windows, Clara's fever broke in the way fevers break suddenly, definitively, in a soaking sweat that required the sheet to be changed and Clara to be gently wiped down and redressed in a clean shift that Helen had in her bag. The child was exhausted and limp, but her color was improving, and when she opened her eyes again, they were clear and present in a way they had not been for 12 hours. Joseph went out to give them privacy during the changing, and when Helen opened the door, he was standing in the narrow hallway with his back against the wall and his hat in his hands, and the particular quality of relief on his face was so naked and unguarded that Helen had to look away from it because it made something hurt in her that she didn't have a name for. "She's going to be all right," Helen told him. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." But the word carried a weight of meaning that a longer sentence could not have held. "Mr. Donnelly," she said, "I owe you a significant debt." "You owe me nothing," he said immediately. "I owe you a doctor in the middle of the night and 6 hours of company and a great deal of water carried from the back pump," she said, and something in her voice had gone dry and slightly wry in a way that surprised them both. She had not been wry in a long time. Wry required a certain safety. He looked at her, and she was close enough in the narrow hallway to see the exact shade of his eyes in the growing dawn light. They were not gray, she realized. They were gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were looking at her with the kind of attention that made her feel uncomfortably like she was being read. "Breakfast," he said. "That's all I want. Let me buy you and Clara breakfast when the saloon kitchen opens, and we'll call the debt paid." She should have said no. There were 100 reasons to say no, starting with Roland Voss and ending with the fact that she had a policy of not acquiring entanglements in towns she was passing through. She had a dark past and a hidden secret and a man hunting her and a child who had been burning with fever 6 hours ago, and none of those things were conducive to sitting across a table from a man who looked at her like she was worth looking at. "All right," she said. "Breakfast." The kitchen opened at 6:30, and me Colton, who had already heard everything from the night man at the saloon bar, and had that specific frontier woman's quality of not making a fuss about things while simultaneously absorbing every relevant detail for permanent storage, produced eggs and salt pork and biscuits, and a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint. And she set it all on the table in the back room, where Clara was propped up on 2 pillows, eating with the determined appetite of a child whose body knew it needed fuel. Helen sat across from Joseph Donnelly and they drank coffee and talked like people who had already skipped the introductory phase of knowing each other and moved directly into something more real and more complicated. And it was both easier and more dangerous than anything Helen had encountered in 3 years of moving and hiding and protecting. He asked her carefully where she was headed. She said south, toward Tucson, possibly west after that. He did not ask why she was moving, which told her that he had already drawn conclusions and was choosing not to press them, which told her something about the kind of man he was. She asked him if he was happy on the Brackman ranch. He considered this for longer than the question seemed to warrant and then said, "I'm all right. Happy is a bigger word than all right." "What would make it a bigger word for you?" she asked, and then immediately wondered why she had asked that, because it was the kind of question you asked someone you intended to know for more than a morning. He looked at his coffee cup. "The same things that make it big for everyone, I suppose. Something that is yours, someone who knows you, a pause, something worth the staying." The phrase hung in the warm morning air between them, and Clara looked up from her biscuit and back and forth between the 2 adults with the particular alert interest of a 7-year-old who is following an adult conversation more closely than either adult realizes. Helen Easton was not a woman who cried. She had not cried in approximately 18 months, which she considered a personal achievement under the circumstances. She did not cry now. But something moved through her chest like a warm tide, something that felt dangerously close to longing, and she had to take a deliberate sip of coffee and remind herself of every reason why longing was a luxury she could not afford. She left 3 days later as planned, or she tried to. The stage south from Dusty Creek ran on Tuesdays and Fridays, and it was a Wednesday when Clara broke her fever, so Helen had 2 days to wait. She told herself this was fine. She would rest. She would help me in the kitchen to earn their keep. She would avoid the tall man who worked cattle 8 miles east and who had sat through the darkest hours of the night with her daughter. She was not remarkably successful at the avoiding part. Joseph Donnelly came back the following day, which was Thursday. He rode into town for supplies, he said, which was a perfectly ordinary thing for a ranch hand to do on a Thursday. He stopped by the saloon, which was also ordinary. He found Helen in the kitchen peeling potatoes for me's lunch service and leaned in the doorway and asked if Clara was recovering well, which was a completely reasonable inquiry. He ended up sitting on the back porch with Clara for 2 hours while the little girl showed him her horse drawings, explaining each one in the detail that Helen recognized as the sign of a child who had found an audience who genuinely wanted to hear. Helen watched from the kitchen window and told herself she was not watching from the kitchen window. What she saw was a large, quiet man sitting cross-legged on a wooden porch in the Arizona sun, accepting the presentation of approximately 40 pencil drawings of horses, with the serious attention of a man attending an important exhibition, asking questions that made Clara's face light up, laughing once at something the child said, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded and brief, that Helen had not heard from him before, and that she immediately wished she had not heard, because it did something extremely inconvenient to her composure. That evening, Joseph ate supper at the saloon with 4 other men from the Brackman crew who had come into town for the same ostensible reason of Thursday supplies, and me, Colton, sat at the bar afterward with Helen and told her several things about Joseph Donnelly that were common knowledge in Dusty Creek. That he had been in the territory for 3 years and had the reputation of a man who was fair and kept his word. That he had never, in anyone's recollection, been deliberately cruel to anyone or anything, which in me, Colton's extensive experience was a rarer quality than most people acknowledged. That he had been briefly courted by a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who ran the dress shop in town, and that nothing had come of it, and that Evelyn Marsh herself had said it wasn't for lack of trying on her part, but that Joseph Donnelly seemed to be waiting for something he couldn't entirely describe. Waiting for something he couldn't describe, Helen repeated, and took a long sip of her coffee. Me gave her the look of a woman who had been watching people for 40 years and had formed her conclusions. I'm not saying a word, me said. I'm just giving you information. Helen slept badly that night, which she attributed to the residual anxiety of Clara's fever and absolutely nothing else. On Friday morning, she packed their bags, settled their account with me in clean coin, and carried their things to the stage depot. Clara walked beside her, holding Miss Penny and wearing the determined expression of a child who has decided not to complain about something she wants to complain about. Joseph was at the stage depot. He was not there for them. He was there to send a letter east, which again was a perfectly ordinary thing. The mail coach shared a route with the passenger stage, and the timing was what it was. He looked at their bags, and then at Helen, and then at Clara, and something shifted in his face that he did not quite manage to conceal before it showed. Heading south, he said. Tucson, Helen said. Then west, most likely. Most likely, he repeated, which was not a question but had the shape of one. Clara had moved away to look at the horses hitched to the stage, and they were briefly, fully alone, and Helen found that she was looking at his face with the same kind of attention she had given it in the lamplight 2 nights ago, and reaching the same inconvenient conclusions. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want you to know I'm not expecting anything from it. I just think it should be said. She waited. In the 3 years I've been in this territory, he said, I have not once felt the particular sensation of not wanting to watch someone's stage pull away. He paused. Until now. The stage driver called out. 2 other passengers were boarding. The horses shifted and stamped. Helen picked up her bag. She looked at Joseph Donnelly with all his steadiness and his gray-green eyes and his hands that had been gentle on her daughter's face in the dark, and she made the calculation of everything she was running from, everything she could and could not offer, and she said the only honest thing. I'm being followed, she said quietly. There is a man from Missouri named Roland Voss who wants what my husband left me and will not stop coming. If he finds out where I am, there will be trouble, real trouble, the kind that follows people around it. Joseph did not flinch. He did not look away. He looked, if anything, more settled, which was not what she had expected. I was a deputy marshal, he said. I know what real trouble looks like. I'm telling you to stay away from it, she said. I hear you, he said. She got on the stage. Clara climbed up beside her. Miss Penny tucked under one arm and pressed her face against Helen's sleeve and said nothing. The driver called out again. The stage lurched into motion. Helen did not look back. She looked back. Joseph Donnelly stood in the middle of the depot road with his hat in his hand and watched the stage until it turned the corner south, and his face in that last glimpse was the face of a man who had made a decision that he had not announced yet. The stage reached Tucson in 2.5 days, through country that was beautiful and waterless and indifferent to human needs in the way that Arizona was beautiful spectacularly, without apology. Helen found them a boarding house room on the east side of town and paid a week in advance and began, for the third time in a year, the process of building a temporary life. She found laundry work within 2 days. Tucson in 1882 was a proper town with a population approaching 7,000, and there was always laundry to be done. Clara, who was fully recovered and bouncing with the resilience of childhood, was enrolled in the Adobe schoolhouse on Pennington Street, where a young woman named Miss Aguilar ran a class of 20 children with authority and genuine affection, and a complete lack of sentimentality about the difficulty of educating children in a frontier town. Helen told herself that Tucson was fine. Tucson was actually better than fine. It was big enough to be anonymous, small enough to be navigable, and it had a proper doctor, a proper school, and water that came from somewhere other than a barrel. She thought about Joseph Donnelly exactly as much as she had promised herself she would not think about him, which was to say constantly, which she managed to disguise from herself by attributing it to gratitude for his help with Clara's fever, which was partially true and therefore partially useful as a disguise. It was Clara who said his name first, approximately 10 days after their arrival in Tucson. They were eating supper in the boarding house dining room, beans and tortillas and a glass of milk that Clara was drinking with the solemnity of a child who has been told milk is important, and Clara said without preamble, "I miss Mr. Donnelly." Helen put down her fork. "He listened to all my drawings," Clara said. "Most people don't listen to all of them. They listen to 3 or 4 and then they get a look." "A look," Helen repeated. "The look that means they want to stop listening but they don't want to be rude." Clara took a bite of tortilla. "Mr. Donnelly didn't get that look even once. He listened to all 43. Helen picked up her fork again. "That was kind of him." "He asked good questions too," Clara said. "He asked which one was the fastest and which one was the bravest and which one I would want to ride if I could. Nobody asks which one I would want to ride." Helen ate her beans and said nothing. "Do you think we'll go back to Dusty Creek?" Clara asked. "No," Helen said, and then felt immediately guilty for the lack of hesitation in that answer, which was protective and cowardly in about equal measure. Clara accepted this with the philosophical resignation of a child, accustomed to answers she did not prefer. She picked up Miss Penny from the bench beside her and arranged the corn-husk doll with her back against the edge of the table. "Miss Penny thinks we should go back," she said. Helen looked at her daughter, 7 years old, with her father's jaw and her mother's dark eyes and the particular grace of a child who had spent her short life in motion and had made her peace with impermanence in a way that children should not have to make peace with it. She reached across the table and smoothed a strand of dark hair from Clara's face. "Miss Penny may be right," she said carefully. "But sometimes we have to go where it's safe first and what's right second." Clara considered this. "Maybe," she said, "right and safe could be the same place." Helen did not have an answer for that, so she poured more beans. 14 days after arriving in Tucson, 3 days after that conversation with Clara, Helen Easton came out of the laundry on Congress Street at 4:30 in the afternoon and nearly walked directly into Roland Voss. He was standing on the boardwalk across the street, talking to a man she did not recognize, wearing a dark coat and the kind of hat that meant money in places where money wanted to be seen. He had not seen her yet. She was in the shadow of the laundry awning, and there were enough people on Congress Street that she was one figure among many. She backed up against the laundry wall and pressed herself there, and waited until her heart had stopped slamming against her ribs with enough force to be heard, which took longer than she would have liked. He looked older. He had always been the kind of man who looked exactly his age, which was now 51, and the past 3 years had settled into his face with the comfortable authority of a man who has spent them doing whatever he pleased. He was heavier in the shoulders, more certain in his bearing. He was talking to the unknown man, with the gestures of someone giving instructions. Helen looked at the unknown man and realized, with a cold clarity that was almost physically painful, that the unknown man was looking at the buildings on her side of the street with the systematic attention of someone performing a search. He had people looking for her. Of course he did. He had always had people looking for her. She waited until Voss and his man had turned the corner north, and then she walked quickly, not running, walking, because running attracted attention to the boarding house, went up the stairs, and stood in the middle of their small room with Clara's drawing cloth and their 2 bags and Miss Penny sitting on the pillow, and she made herself think clearly through the fear. She could run again. She was practiced at it. She could have them on a stage west before noon tomorrow and be in Yuma by the weekend, and Voss would have to start his search over, or she could stop running. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Clara's drawings, the horses, the clouds. One drawing, near the bottom of the pile, that Clara had done in Dusty Creek, a large figure sitting cross-legged on a porch with a smaller figure beside him, identifiable by the corn-husk doll held carefully in her lap. Helen sat for a very long time. Then she went downstairs and asked the boarding house keeper for paper and a pencil, and she sat at the small writing table in the parlor and wrote a letter to Joseph Donnelly at the Brackman Ranch, Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory. She was not a skilled writer. She had taught herself to read and write adequately as an adult, and her handwriting was careful and functional rather than elegant. The letter took 3 drafts, and she burned the first 2 in the parlor fireplace and started over. The final version said, "Mr. Donnelly, I find that I am in a situation that has become more complicated than I can manage alone, and that I have been too proud to say so until it became urgent. The man I told you about has found me in Tucson. I am not asking you for anything. I am simply telling you the truth because you once sat through a long, dark night on no other basis than being decent, and I think you would want to know. We are at the Beaumont boarding house on 4th Avenue. We are all right for the moment. Helen Easton." She read it 4 times. She changed nothing. She walked to the postal office before it closed and sent it. Then she went back and told Clara they might be moving again, and Clara put Miss Penny carefully in her bag without complaint, and with an expression of 7-year-old stoicism that broke Helen's heart precisely because it was so practiced. "I know it's hard," Helen said. "I know you're trying," Clara said, which was worse than a complaint somehow, which was everything. Joseph Donnelly received the letter on a Tuesday. He was at the Brackman Ranch, mending fence in the lower pasture, when one of the younger hands rode out with the mail that had come on the morning stage. Joseph read Helen's letter standing in the lower pasture with the fence posts and his tools around him, read it twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. He went to find Elias Brackman, who was the owner of the ranch and a man who ran his operation with the measured authority of someone who had built something real from nothing and intended to keep it. He told Brackman he needed 2 weeks, possibly 3, and he offered no specific explanation beyond the fact that there was a woman and a child in Tucson, in a situation that required settling. Elias Brackman was 63 years old and had been married to the same woman for 38 years and had seen most of what men could be. He looked at Joseph for a long moment and then said, "Take what you need. Your job will be here when you come back." Joseph saddled his horse, a dark bay Morgan named Declan that he had owned for 5 years, and that was, in his quiet opinion, the finest animal in the Arizona Territory, and he rode for Tucson. He arrived 2 days after Helen had sent the letter, which, given the distances and conditions of the territory, was almost miraculous, and he went directly to the Beaumont boarding house on 4th Avenue. Helen opened the boarding house door and found him standing on the step in his road dust with his hat in his hand, and she felt something that was relief and something else that was more complicated and more frightening, and she said, "You came," which was not what she had planned to say. "I came," he said. She stepped back to let him in. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, took one look at him, and came down the stairs faster than she had moved since before the fever, and Joseph caught her automatic forward momentum with the ease of a man who had expected it, crouching down to her level. "You came back," Clara said. "I did," he said. "Mama wrote you a letter," Clara informed him. "She did," he said. "That's why I came." Clara examined his face from close range. "She didn't tell me what the letter said." "She said there was a problem and she told me the truth about it," Joseph said. "That's the important part." Clara accepted this and then said very seriously, "Mr. Donnelly, I drew more horses since I saw you last. 11 more. Then I've got catching up to do," he said gravely. Helen stood in the boarding house entry hall and watched this exchange and felt the warm tide again, the longing tide, and this time she had no immediate reason to push it down. He had come. She had told him the truth, the whole shape of it, and he had come anyway. She did not know what that meant yet. She did not know what she was going to do with it, but she let herself feel it just briefly, the way you let yourself feel the first warmth of spring sun on your face after a long winter, carefully, hopefully, not quite believing it would last. "Tell me about Voss," Joseph said, when Clara had gone back upstairs with the promise of a proper audience for the 11 new drawings after supper. Helen told him, all of it. The property, the papers, the skillet, the night she ran, the 3 years of moving. She told him without embellishment and without self-pity, which was how she told everything, and when she was done she looked at him steadily and waited for his reaction. "Does he know you're here specifically?" Joseph asked. "His man was looking at buildings on Congress Street," Helen said. "He had narrowed it to this part of town. It was only a matter of days." "What does the property amount to?" 240 acres in Abilene County, she said. "It's good land. Water access from a creek that doesn't dry up in summer. Thomas bought it at proper price and has the deed registered with the county clerk. The deed is in your name now, since Thomas died. It should be," she said. "Thomas's will named me as sole beneficiary. But Voss had friends in the county administration, and I didn't stay around long enough to find out whether the will had been properly executed before I left." Joseph was quiet for a moment, working through it. "You've been running from a property dispute," he said carefully. "And from a man who put his hands on me," Helen said, and her voice was absolutely level and absolutely cold. Joseph's jaw tightened. "Just once briefly, and then it was still again." "I understand," he said. "I don't want him arrested," Helen said. "I don't trust the law enough in this territory for that. What I want is to stop running. What I want is for Clara to go to school for more than 4 months at a time." She paused. "I want a garden." He looked at her. "A garden. I want to plant things and watch them come up," she said. "I want to know that the thing I planted will be there in a week. I have not had that in 3 years. He was quiet for a moment, and then something moved in his face, something that was decision-shaped, deliberate, and clear-eyed. "I have a proposal," he said. "And I want you to hear it all the way through before you tell me it's impossible." She sat back in her chair and crossed her hands in her lap and waited. "Voss is in Tucson looking for you," he said. "Which means he's 40 miles from Dusty Creek. If we move back to Dusty Creek, he'll eventually trace you there too, but it buys time and it puts you in a town where I know people and where me Colton runs a good establishment and where there are people who would help if needed." He paused. "That's the first part. The second part is more complicated." "Go on," she said. "There's a piece of land 3 miles west of Dusty Creek that's been sitting untouched for 2 years because the previous owner died in debt and nobody's bothered to file proper claim on it. It's 40 acres, not 240, but it has a creek and a well and a 2-room cabin that needs work, but it's standing. I looked at it when I first came to the territory and I've thought about it since." He stopped. I have $400 saved. That's enough to file claim and do the repairs and get through the first season." Helen looked at him very carefully. "Mr. Donnelly." "Joseph," he said. "Please." "Joseph," she said. "Are you telling me you want to buy land and fix a cabin for a woman and her daughter you've known for less than 2 weeks?" "I'm telling you," he said, "that I've been looking at that land for 3 years because I was waiting until it meant something to do something with it." He met her eyes directly. "That I'd like the opportunity to court you properly, if you're willing, and that the rest can follow from there in whatever way it naturally would." Helen Easton sat in the Beaumont boarding house parlor in Tucson, Arizona Territory, in the year 1882, and looked at this man, this patient, solid, gentle man who had ridden through the night for a child he didn't know and who had come 2 days riding for a woman who had warned him away. And she felt the warm tide again, and this time she let it come. "You should know," she said, "that I am not easy to live with. I sleep lightly, and I am suspicious of people by habit, and I will probably point a gun at you at least twice more before we reach any kind of comfortable familiarity. I'll take my chances," he said, and the thing around his eyes moved again, and this time it was fully a smile, and it was the most disarming thing she had encountered in 3 years of encounters. "You should also know," she said, "that Clara is the most important person in my life and always will be, and that any arrangement that does not account for her first and fully is not an arrangement I can consider." "I know," he said. "That's one of the things about you." She looked at him. "What do you mean, that's one of the things about you?" "The things I noticed," he said, and he was not smiling now. He was entirely serious in the way that he was entirely serious about most things that mattered. "You sat by that child for 16 hours without leaving. You talked about her the whole night and every word of it was love." He paused. "That's not a thing I would subtract from. That's a thing I would want to be near." Helen pressed her lips together and looked at the window because if she kept looking at him she was going to cry, and she was not doing that. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. She thought about it for approximately 48 hours, during which time Joseph stayed at a different boarding house 2 streets over because he understood the particular importance of not pressing, and during which time Clara asked 6 separate questions about the 40-acre property near Dusty Creek, with an attention to agricultural detail that was entirely self-generated and entirely unsolicited, and during which time Helen lay awake in the dark listening to her daughter breathe, and thought about gardens and schools and staying still, and what it meant to trust someone with the weight of your actual life. On the 3rd morning she went to Joseph's boarding house at 7 in the morning and knocked on the door, and when he opened it she said, "I want to see the land first, before I decide." "Then let's ride," he said, and the smile was back, brief and real and warm, and he turned to get his hat. They rode back to Dusty Creek in 3 days, taking the northern route because Joseph had correctly calculated that Voss's search in Tucson was concentrated south of Congress Street, and they traveled as a family, or the closest approximation of one, which was a tall man on a dark bay Morgan, and a woman on a hired roan, and a little girl sitting in front of her mother holding Miss Penny, and looking at everything the landscape offered with the same sharp, cataloging attention she brought to horse drawings. The land 3 miles west of Dusty Creek was 40 acres of red rock and scrub grass and 2 cottonwood trees, by a creek that ran clear and cold even in August, which was a small miracle in itself. The cabin was 2 rooms of rough adobe with a board floor that had warped in places, and a window in the main room that had lost its glass, and the roof needed attention, and the well was good, and there was a corral with 1 standing post and 3 that had fallen, and the light in the late afternoon was extraordinary, the kind of light that the Arizona Territory produces in the hour before sunset, all gold and rose and violet, with the shadows of the red rocks stretching long across the flat ground. Clara got down from the horse and walked the perimeter of the property with the focused authority of a property assessor, examining the creek, investigating the cabin, staring at the cottonwood trees with her hands on her hips. Helen stood beside the horse and looked at the cabin and the creek and the light, and then she looked at Joseph. He was watching her. Not watching to see if she approved exactly, but watching the way he watched most things he cared about steadily and without pressure, giving her room to come to her own conclusions. She walked to the creek and stood at its edge and looked at the water. It was April in 1882, and the creek was running well, clear over red and brown stones, making the sound that moving water makes, which is the best sound in the world if you have been living somewhere without it. She thought about Thomas, who had been good and steady and kind, and who had given her Clara and 240 acres in Kansas that she had never been able to stand on. She thought about the 3 years of stages and boarding houses and the careful, exhausting mathematics of survival. She thought about a man sitting beside a child's cot in the small hours of the night, carrying buckets of water without being asked, asking which horse she would want to ride. "It needs a lot of work," she said. "It does," Joseph agreed. "The roof will have to be entirely redone before summer." "Yes, and someone needs to rehang that window before the dust gets worse. I'll see to it this week." She turned to face him. He was standing about 6 feet away, hat in hand, in the extraordinary late light. "I want a garden on the south side," she said. "The soil looks good there." He looked at the south side of the cabin. "It does," he said. "Good sun exposure." "I want Clara to go to school in Dusty Creek through a full year," she said. "Not 4 months, a full year." "Me Colton will know who to speak to about that," he said. "And I want to understand that this is," she paused, searching for the right word, not finding it in the simple category she had tried to put it in. "That this is real," she said finally. "Not a kindness and not a rescue. I'm not someone who needs rescuing." "I know you're not," he said immediately, and the quality of his certainty was so complete and unconditional that she stopped looking for the trap in it. "If I'm going to trust you," she said, "it will be because I've decided to, not because you've maneuvered me into it." "I understand," he said. "I am going to make mistakes," she said. "I have lived alone and frightened for 3 years, and that does things to a person, and some of them are not convenient things." "I have also lived alone and frightened," he said quietly, "although mine was a different kind of frightened. I think we are probably both going to make mistakes." She looked at him for a long moment in the gold Arizona light, and then she said, "All right, Joseph, let's start with the roof." He blinked. "Now." "Not now. Tomorrow." She turned toward Clara, who had completed her property assessment, and was heading back toward them with an expression of 7-year-old determination. "But I want to be in this cabin in 2 weeks." 2 weeks, he said, and nodded, and there was something in his face that was not just agreement but the particular kind of gladness that comes from something you have been carefully hoping for finally becoming solid and real. 2 weeks, it turned out, was ambitious. 3 weeks was accurate. Joseph Donnelly was a man who worked with everything he had, which turned out to be a great deal. He was competent with timber and adobe and roof tiles and the particular carpentry of a frontier cabin, and he recruited 2 of the Brackman Ranch hands for 3 days of heavy work with the promise of future labor in return, which was how the frontier economy operated. Helen worked alongside him. She had good hands and she was not afraid of labor, and she had no interest in standing to the side watching while someone else fixed the place she intended to live. She learned more about Joseph in those 3 weeks of shared work than she had learned in any conversation, which is often how it goes with people whose actions are their most honest language. He was methodical and patient, and he did things properly, even when doing them properly took longer than doing them adequately would have. He did not curse when something went wrong, but he got very quiet in a way that was more expressive than cursing. He remembered everything you told him. He cooked better than most men she'd met on the frontier, specifically beans and anything that could be done in a cast iron pan, and he made coffee with the seriousness it deserved. He was also, she discovered, quietly funny in a way that only appeared when he felt comfortable, which was not immediately. It was around the end of the 2nd week, when he said something about the crooked window frame that was dry and unexpected enough that Helen laughed before she could decide whether to a genuine laugh, surprised out of her. And the look on his face when she laughed was the look of a man who had been given something he had not expected to receive and was going to be careful with it. She found herself looking for the funny thing. She found herself watching for the thing he would say. This was a symptom, she understood clearly, but she let herself have it. Clara adored him without reservation or complication, in the way that children adore people who take them seriously, and this was both easier than Helen had expected and more significant. She watched her daughter and Joseph in conversation, often long, meandering conversations about horses and clouds, and the comparative speeds of hawks, and the question of whether or not rivers thought about where they were going, and felt something settle in her chest like a stone finding its place in water. Something that had been suspended, vibrating with unresolved tension becoming still. On a warm Saturday in early May, they moved into the cabin. It was not yet entirely finished. The south room still needed its floor repaired. The garden had been dug but not yet planted. There were no curtains on the windows and the furniture was minimal. 2 beds, a table, 3 chairs, and a wood stove that Joseph had carried in pieces from the Dusty Creek hardware store on a borrowed wagon, and reassembled with the detailed attention of a man performing surgery. But the roof was solid and the window was new glass, and there was a door that locked with a real lock. And when Helen stood in the main room and looked around at the bare, clean, honest space of it, she felt something she recognized as the antecedent to home, which she had not felt in any room for 3 years. Clara immediately claimed the south room and began the process of organizing it with the territorial conviction of a child who has never had a room and intends to treat this one with appropriate reverence. Joseph stayed in the Brackman bunkhouse. He came to the property every day working mostly, with the ongoing list of things that needed attention. But he was correct and careful about the boundaries of what they were and what they were not yet, and Helen found, to her own surprise, that his correctness made her want the distance to close faster rather than making it feel adequate. She was not, she acknowledged to herself on a Wednesday in late May while pulling weeds from the new garden, a woman who had ever been good at patience where feelings were concerned. She had been patient in every practical respect, in strategy, in survival, in the daily endurance of difficulty. But feelings had always moved fast in her, which was perhaps why she had locked them down so completely for 3 years. Too fast or too locked. She had not yet learned the middle. She wiped her hands on her work apron and stood up from the garden and looked at where Joseph was repairing the corral fence 60 feet away. And she thought about the night of Clara's fever and everything that had happened since, and she made another decision. She went to the corral. He heard her coming and turned from the fence with a question in his face that became something quieter and more careful as she stopped about 4 feet away. "I have something to tell you," she said. "All right," he said. "I am trying very hard," she said, "to be sensible about this, about you and me and what this is and what it might be. I'm trying because I have a child and a past and a man who is still somewhere in this territory who hasn't given up, and those are all real things that require sensible management." "They are," he said. "And I'm not doing very well at it," she said. He was very still. "I think about you constantly," she said, and saying it out loud after weeks of not saying it was like setting down something heavy that she had been carrying for too long. "I think about the night of Clara's fever, and I think about the things you said in the stage depot, and I think about the way you listened to 43-horse drawings, and I think—" She stopped. "I think I am very much in danger of being deeply and unreservedly in love with you, and I wanted you to know that before I talked myself out of saying it." Joseph Donnelly set down the fence post he was holding. He stepped across the 4 feet between them, which took approximately 1.5 of his long strides, and he took her face in his scarred, calloused, careful hands and he kissed her. It was not the first kiss she had imagined it might be. It was not tentative or questioning. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting to say something clearly and had finally found the right way to say it, and it said, unmistakably, everything he had not put into words for weeks and weeks. Helen kissed him back. She was not tentative either. When they separated, she looked at his face from very close range and felt the warm tide, full and enormous and not frightening anymore, moving through her chest. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since about 3 in the morning on the night of Clara's fever, when you told me she could already read better than most adults you'd met, and the way you said it was the bravest thing I'd ever heard." Helen pressed her forehead against his jaw for a moment and breathed. "We still have the problem of Roland Voss," she said. "I know," he said. "We'll handle it, and the property in Kansas. We'll handle that too." "You say that very easily," she said. "I mean it that simply," he said. She stepped back and looked at him. The corral fence was half repaired, and the garden was pulled, and the cabin behind her had a new roof, and a locked door and her daughter's drawings on the wall, and the man in front of her was looking at her with steady gray-green eyes that did not contain a single thing she recognized as hidden motive or secret angle or trap. "All right," she said. "Then let's handle it." The handling of Roland Voss began with a letter to a lawyer in Abilene, Kansas, which Joseph composed with the methodical thoroughness he brought to fence repair, citing Thomas Easton's registered will and the improperly contested deed, and the documented facts of Voss's pattern of behavior in the county. Joseph knew, from his time as a deputy marshal, the specific legal channels that moved fastest in territorial disputes, and he knew which names in the Federal Land Administration held actual weight and which ones were ornamental. It took 6 weeks and 3 more letters and a significant portion of Joseph's savings. In July of 1882, a federal land agent named Marcus Webb arrived in Dusty Creek with the official executed deed to Helen Easton's Kansas property, confirmed and recorded in her name, and with a separate document indicating that Roland Voss had been formally charged in Abilene County with fraudulent contestation of a properly filed estate, which carried enough weight to make further pursuit of Helen's land legally untenable and personally inadvisable. Helen held the deed in her hands in the main room of the cabin and read it twice, and then folded it and put it in the tin box she had bought at the Dusty Creek General Store for exactly this purpose. "He's still out there," she said. "He is," Joseph agreed. "But he's out there with a federal land charge against him and without a legal claim, and men like that generally find another angle when the legal one closes." He paused. "He'll look for easier prey." "That's a dark thing to say about the world," Helen said. "It's an accurate thing to say about men like him," Joseph said, and she knew he was right, which made it dark and accurate simultaneously. She had not fully exhaled yet. She would not fully exhale for several more months, waking in the night sometimes with the electric certainty that something was wrong, lying still in the dark and listening until the silence reassured her. But the deed was real and the charge was real, and the cabin had a locked door, and Joseph Donnelly was 8 miles away at the Brackman Ranch, and would come if she sent for him, which was more than she had had for 3 years. She planted the garden. Tomatoes and beans and 3 rows of corn and, in a sunny corner, sunflowers, because Clara had asked for sunflowers, and you cannot reasonably refuse a child sunflowers when you finally have a piece of ground to plant them in. Clara started school in Dusty Creek in September, in the one-room schoolhouse on the north end of town, run by a man named Mr. Aldridge, who was strict but not unkind, and who recognized within 2 weeks that Helen's daughter was considerably ahead of most of her classmates, and treated her accordingly. Clara walked the 3 miles into town and back every school day with the focused energy of a child who has found something she is good at and wants more of it. And she came home every afternoon full of information that she presented at supper with the organized enthusiasm of a scholar. She also, increasingly, presented this information to Joseph, who had taken to having supper at the cabin on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Sunday afternoons, which had begun as an arrangement of practical convenience and had become something much more ceremonial. Helen noticed the particular quality of the Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The way the cabin felt different with all three of them in it, fuller, warmer, more like the word she had been circling carefully for months. She and Joseph talked a great deal, in those evenings and in the long Sunday afternoons. They talked about Ireland and Kansas and the territory and what they wanted and what they had lost and what they believed. And those conversations had the quality that conversations have when the people having them are not performing or strategizing, but simply being. She told him things she had not said aloud since Thomas died about being lonely in the ordinary middle of her marriage, about what it had felt like to discover that she was capable of the particular focused fierceness that surviving alone required. He told her about Alice and Nora with a grief that was real but no longer acute, the grief of something you have fully mourned and carry with you gently rather than something still open and bleeding. He told her, on a September Sunday, with the cooling air coming through the new window and Clara asleep in the south room, that he had spent the years after Nora died convincing himself that what he had had was sufficient, that he had been lucky once and would not ask for luck twice. That the thing you want to ask for twice is always the thing that could hurt you most. Helen was quiet for a moment and then said, I spent 3 years not wanting anything because wanting seemed like something I couldn't afford. And now, he said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. He looked back. Now, she said carefully, I want a great many things and most of them are in this general vicinity. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that for a while in the cooling September air, and it was the simplest and most profound thing. He proposed to her in October on a Saturday evening when the desert had gone gold and violet again in the last light and Clara was drawing by the window in the south room and the stove was warm and the cabin smelled of supper and wood smoke. He did it simply and without theater, which was consistent with everything else about him. He said, Helen, I would like to marry you if you'll have me. I'd like to be here properly. I'd like Clara to have what she should have. He paused. And I'd like what I want, which is you, which I've been wanting since long before I said so. Helen said, yes, before he finished the sentence. She said it the way she said everything true, immediately, clearly, without hesitation, because she had spent 3 years having to be certain before she committed to anything, and she was certain. Clara, it turned out, had been listening from the doorway. Are you going to be married? She asked, with the exact same expression she used when she was assessing the property, calculating, alert, several steps ahead of the apparent question. We are, Helen said. Clara came into the room and stood in front of Joseph and gave him a long, evaluating look. Will you live here? She asked. If your mother will have me, he said, and if you will. Clara considered this. You'd have to repair the fence on the east side, she said. It's been needing doing. I'll do it this week, he said. And Miss Penny likes the shelf in the south room, she said. She's not moving to a different shelf. Miss Penny's shelf is her own to keep, he agreed. Clara studied him for another long moment, with the full weight of her 7-year-old assessment, and then she did something Helen had not seen her do with anyone except her mother. She stepped forward and put her arms around Joseph Donnelly's neck and pressed her cheek against his jaw. He held her like something precious and looked at Helen over the top of her daughter's dark head with an expression that was full to the edges, and Helen's throat tightened with everything she did not have words for. They were married in November of 1882, in the Dusty Creek church that had been built the previous spring, by a circuit preacher named Reverend Coates, who came through once a month, and who had a kindly, practical approach to matrimony that suited both of them exactly. Me Colton and Elias Brackman and his wife were witnesses. Clara stood beside her mother in a blue dress that Me had helped them make, with Miss Penny tucked under one arm, and she was perfectly serious throughout the ceremony with the exception of the moment the Reverend got to the part about joy, at which point she smiled so widely and so suddenly that Helen had to look away, or she would not have been able to continue standing steady. Joseph had bought a wedding ring from the jeweler in Tucson on his last supply trip. A plain gold band, properly sized, that he had commissioned based on the measurement that Helen had provided by wrapping a piece of string around her finger in what she told herself was a purely practical exercise. When he put it on her finger during the ceremony, she looked down at it and then up at him, and the expression on his face was the full, unguarded version of every look she had catalogued and memorized over the past 7 months, and it undid her completely in the best possible way. She was not crying. She had maintained her position on not crying, but her eyes were doing something that the Arizona Territory light could generously attribute to the angle of the November sun through the church windows. Joseph, she noticed, was also doing something similar with his eyes. She decided that they were both, in this respect, equal and did not raise the subject. He moved into the cabin that weekend. He brought his personal items in 2 saddlebags, which was everything he owned in the world beyond his horse and his tools, and he moved into the main room of the cabin with a lack of fanfare entirely appropriate to a man who had been essentially living there already for 4 months. Clara presented him, on his first official morning as a resident, with a framed drawing of the 3 of them standing in front of the cabin, rendered in the careful, detailed pencil style she had been developing for 2 years. She had even drawn Declan the horse in the background, which Joseph later said was the most complete representation of his family he had ever seen, and which Helen noticed he placed in the exact center of the main room wall. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the first winter Helen had not been afraid. There were hard days. The cold was dry and sharp, and the wood supply required constant management, and there was a week in January when the creek froze over, and the water had to be hauled and heated on the stove. But the cabin was sound and the stove was good, and there was food in the larder, and the person who breathed in the dark beside her was a person she had chosen with full knowledge and without constraint, and that made every ordinary difficulty merely ordinary. She learned more about him in that winter than in any other season. She learned that he was a light sleeper, and that he kept a rifle under the bed, which she completely understood and approved of. She learned that he had strong opinions about the proper preparation of coffee, and that this was actually one of his best qualities, because so did she and they turned out to agree. She learned that he sang to himself when he was working alone outside Irish songs, mostly, in a low and entirely sincere voice that he deployed with no self-consciousness and no awareness that anyone could hear him, and that Helen heard from the kitchen window with the specific, private tenderness of discovering something true about a person that they have not chosen to display. She told him once that she had heard him singing. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "My mother sang those songs. I didn't know I'd kept them until they started coming out of me out here." A pause. "I hope they're not annoying." "They're not," she said. "They're the opposite of annoying." He looked at her sideways. The opposite of annoying is a very wide category. "You know what I mean," she said. He did. He always knew what she meant. This was either the best thing about him or the most disorienting thing, and she had never quite resolved the question. In the spring of 1883, Helen discovered she was pregnant. She told Joseph on a March evening with the first green appearing at the edges of the property, and the garden coming out of dormancy, and the light going long and golden as it only did in the spring of the desert. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to her with an expression she recognized as the full version of what she had seen in shadows and in partial form over the months of knowing him, raw and open and undefended, the expression of a man for whom this particular miracle had not been expected and had arrived like a physical blow to the center of the chest. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was careful and his hands found her face. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "It's early yet. March, so probably November." "November," he said. He was still processing. "Joseph," she covered his hands with hers. "Are you all right?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said in a voice that had gone rough at the edges, "I didn't know if I'd get this again. I thought after Alice and after Nora." He stopped. "I know," she said. "I'm all right," he said. I'm very all right. He pressed his forehead against hers. I'm so all right it's honestly a little alarming. She laughed, and he held her, and the March light moved across the 40 acres of their particular piece of the Arizona territory, and the creek ran behind the cottonwood trees, and somewhere in the cabin behind them, Clara was doing her school lessons with a diligence that would have made Mr. Aldridge proud. Clara received the news of the approaching sibling with the careful evaluation she brought to all significant information. She asked several logistical questions. Where would the baby sleep? What would happen if it cried at night during school days? Whether she would be expected to share Miss Penny's shelf? And when these questions were answered satisfactorily, she said, "I'd like a brother." "That's not something we get to choose," Helen told her. "I know," Clara said, "but I'd like one anyway." Clara got her brother. William Thomas Donnelly was born on a cold November morning in 1883, in the cabin on the 40 acres west of Dusty Creek, with Doc Haskell in attendance and Me Colton providing the kind of calm, practical support that women on the frontier provided each other, because there was often no other kind. He was a large, healthy, vocally emphatic baby who announced his arrival with a fervor that startled even the horses in the corral, and who, from the first morning of his life, had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's jaw. Joseph Donnelly held his son for the first time with the same hands that had been gentle on Clara's feverish cheek, and he held him like something both precious and real, and he did not say anything for several minutes. Helen, who was exhausted and sore and profoundly satisfied in a way that went down to the bone, watched his face and stored the image of it somewhere she would not lose it. Clara came in from the outer room where she had been waiting with the determined patience of an 8-year-old who had decided that patience was what the situation required, and she looked at the baby in her stepfather's arms with a long, assessing stare. "He's very loud," she said. "He is," Joseph agreed. "Does he always do that?" "For a while," Helen said. Clara came closer and looked at the baby's face with the intensity she brought to everything important. The baby, as if aware of being examined, opened his eyes and stared back with the ancient, unfocused gaze of the newborn. "Hello, William," Clara said seriously. "I'm your sister. I'm going to teach you about horses." William Thomas Donnelly regarded his sister with his gray-green eyes, and then he closed them again with the decisive authority of someone who had decided that this particular interaction was complete. Clara turned to her mother. "I like him," she announced. The years that followed were built of ordinary things. The 40 acres grew. By 1885, Joseph had expanded the property to 60 acres by purchasing the adjacent parcel from its absentee Kansas owner, and they had added a proper barn and a second corral and a chicken house that Clara designed herself with an architectural precision that made Joseph say, only half joking, that she had a future as an engineer. The cabin had been extended to 4 rooms, 2 proper bedrooms and a main room and a kitchen, with glass windows throughout and curtains that Helen made herself on the sewing machine she had bought with the proceeds from selling Clara's corn season drawings to a paper in Tucson, which had wanted illustrations for a piece about frontier life, and had offered real money for the kind of detailed, specific work that Clara could produce by 11 years old. Clara went to school with the devotion of a born scholar, and came home every day with enough information to fill 3 conversations. She read everything she could find, which on the frontier required creativity, but the lending library in Tucson had a good catalog that traveled well, and Helen ordered books for her by the crate from a bookseller in San Francisco until Clara's shelf, Miss Penny now permanently at the far left, books filling the rest, occupied most of one wall of her bedroom. She also continued to draw horses. By 1886, she had 237 drawings that she kept in 2 rolled cloths, and she had begun using the new-style photographic reproduction process to have some of them printed, which was a modern miracle that she discussed with Joseph in the technical detail of someone who had done her research. William grew from his initial emphatic loudness into a quieter, more watchful child who had his father's patience and his mother's directness and his sister's curious intelligence, and who from the age of 2 had an abiding devotion to the chickens that was not entirely rational but was entirely genuine, and who by 4 had given each of them a name and a documented personality. Helen had her garden. She had her tomatoes and beans and corn and the sunflowers that came back every year and that Clara had once described, in a school composition that Mr. Aldridge sent home with a note of particular commendation, as the most deliberately optimistic things she knew. In 1886, a letter arrived from Abilene, Kansas. It was from a lawyer named Greer, and it informed Helen that Roland Voss had died in February of that year, of a cardiac episode at the age of 55. The letter further noted that the 240 acres were still legally registered in Helen's name, and that the property had been tenanted by a farming family named Plunkett for the past 3 years who had been paying rent to the county escrow, and that if Helen wished to sell the property, the Plunkett family had expressed strong interest in purchasing it at a fair market price. Helen read this letter 3 times. She sat with it for 2 days. Then she wrote back to Lawyer Greer and told him to proceed with the sale to the Plunkett family at the fair price, and to hold the proceeds for collection or transfer as she directed. She told Joseph that evening. He read the letter and handed it back and said, "How do you feel?" She thought about this carefully. "I feel," she said, "like I've been waiting for something to be over for 7 years and now it is, and there should be some large feeling attached to that, but mostly what I feel is that I want to plant more sunflowers next spring." Joseph considered this. "That seems like a reasonable way to feel," he said. "I feel guilty," she said more quietly, "that I feel mostly relieved. He was a bad man and I'm relieved he's gone, and I don't know what that says about me." "It says," Joseph said, "that you were scared of him for a long time and now you don't have to be any more, and relief is the appropriate response to being safe." He paused. "It's not required to be more complicated than that." She looked at him. "When did you become so sensible about feelings?" "I have been sensible about feelings since approximately the night I rode 12 miles in the dark for a child I'd never met," he said, "on the basis that it seemed like the right thing to do." She took his hand across the supper table and held it, and they sat in the lamplight of the 4-room cabin with William asleep in his room and Clara's lamp visible under her door, and the desert outside cool and quiet and immense. The money from the Kansas sale was significant. It was more than Helen had expected from tenant-farmed land, and it provided a choice that she had not, in the years of their building life, fully anticipated having. She and Joseph talked about it over several evenings with the practical thoroughness they brought to all large decisions, because they had developed, over 4 years of marriage, a particular language of partnership, not division of territory or assignment of roles, but genuine conversation about everything, including the large things, the difficult things, the things that required both of them to think out loud until they arrived somewhere true. They expanded the property. They bought the remaining 2 parcels adjacent to the 60 acres, bringing it to an even 120, and they hired 2 ranch hands and began properly running cattle on the upper pasture, where the grass was good, and they built a second water tank fed from the creek for the dry months. Clara, who was 13 in 1888, and had opinions about everything with a force of conviction that made Joseph say privately to Helen that she was going to be either a lawyer or a force of nature, had a specific proposal regarding the east pasture that involved quarter horses and breeding, and which she had researched with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and which Joseph assessed with the seriousness it deserved and declared both feasible and smart. By 1889, Clara's first quarter horse was on the property. She named her Meridian and treated her with the full weight of 6 years of accumulated horse knowledge, and Meridian repaid this by being, as far as the local horse community could determine, the finest animal in the county east of Tucson. William, at 6 years old, divided his attention between his chickens. his sister's horse, and the question of where exactly the clouds went when they stopped being clouds, which he had been investigating with the systematic attention of a future scientist. He had also, by 1889, developed the habit of following his father around the property on working days and asking questions about everything with an uninterrupted thoroughness that Joseph answered with patient detail and occasional creative license, and that resulted in William having a better practical understanding of land management at age 6 than most ranch hands had at 20. In the spring of 1890, Helen discovered she was pregnant again. She was 35 years old. She told Joseph on a May morning, with the sunflowers just coming up and William chasing the chickens in the yard, and Clara visible on the fence rail talking to Meridian with the focused earnestness she brought to all significant conversations. Joseph was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to her with exactly the expression she had catalogued and stored 7 years ago, when she told him about William, and the warmth of him being entirely, completely, undefendedly glad was the same as it had always been, unchanged by anything, and she felt it the same way she had always felt it, like the first morning of spring, like the specific luxury of warmth when you have been cold for a very long time. "A sister," William said at supper that evening when they told the children. He had decided on the spot with the directness of a 6-year-old what he wanted. "That's not something we choose," Clara told him, with the authority of a 14-year-old delivering information to a younger sibling for the 100th time. "I know," William said, "but I think it would be nice." Their second daughter, their third child, the fifth person of this particular family that had assembled itself piece by piece from grief and distance, and a fever night in 1882, was born in December of 1890, on a cold and brilliantly clear morning, and she was small and dark-haired and vocally unambiguous about her opinions from the first hour, which Helen and Joseph agreed was consistent with the family character. William looked at her with the serious, evaluating expression of a child who has been waiting for something and is now assessing whether it is what he ordered. Then he said, "She's good." "She is," Helen agreed. "What's her name?" he asked. Helen looked at Joseph. They had discussed names as they discussed everything. She said, "Her name is Alice." Joseph looked at the baby in her arms. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he looked up at Helen, and there was the fullness again and the gratitude and the history of everything, and she held his gaze for a long moment and let him see in her face that she meant everything that the name meant. "Alice," he said. "Alice," Helen confirmed. Clara came and stood beside the bed and looked at her new sister with an expression that moved from assessment to something softer, more private, and entirely real. She put her finger carefully in the baby's hand, and Alice Donnelly, 6 hours old and absolutely certain of herself, gripped it with the authority of someone who has found what she was looking for. The house was loud that Christmas. 4 of them, 5 now with Alice, and the ranch hands coming and going, and me Colton coming for the holiday dinner that Helen cooked in the expanded kitchen with the wood stove and the good light and the window that looked south toward the garden where the sunflowers had gone to seed and would come back in spring. Elias Brackman and his wife came. The schoolteacher, Miss Aldridge now, who was Mr. Aldridge's daughter and had taken over the school when her father retired in 1888, came with her husband. There were enough people in the 4-room cabin that it stopped having corners and became simply a warm interior full of voices, and the smell of roasting meat and coffee, and the particular sound of December on the Arizona desert. Helen stood in the kitchen in the middle of it and felt, with the specificity of something finally named, the feeling she had been circling for 8 years. Joseph came and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, which was the main room of the cabin full of people she knew. "All right?" he asked. "Very all right," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who has been leaning into the same person for years and knows exactly how it works, knows the particular angle and the particular fit and the particular solidity of it. Clara was at the far end of the room, deep in a conversation with Miss Aldridge about the possibility of schooling beyond what Dusty Creek could offer, because Clara at 15 had outpaced the curriculum and was now the kind of student who needed something larger, and who everyone, including Mr. Aldridge before his retirement, had agreed was genuinely exceptional. They had been writing letters to a women's college in California, and the responses had been encouraging, and the prospect of it was both exciting and aching in the way that a child's expansion is always aching for the people who love them most. William was explaining something to Elias Brackman with the articulate conviction of a 7-year-old, and Elias was listening with the respect due a fellow professional, and the quality of it made Helen smile. Alice was in Joseph's mother's old rocking chair. They had received it from his surviving aunt in Ireland the previous year, shipped at immense difficulty across the Atlantic and the country, and she was asleep in it with the peaceful authority of an infant who has decided that noise is simply the ambient condition of existence. Helen looked at the room. The drawings on the wall, Clara's early horse drawings that they had framed, and William's cloud paintings, and a photograph that had been taken in Tucson the previous summer of all 5 of them standing in front of the expanded cabin in the particular Arizona light, the books on the shelf, the stove, the window with the south-facing view toward the garden. Joseph pressed his lips to her temple. She turned her face into his jaw and breathed. She breathed the smell of him, which was wood smoke and soap, and the particular outdoor quality of a man who worked the land he lived on, and she thought about a woman in a boarding house in Kansas who had wanted a garden and a locked door and a school within walking distance, and had settled for years for none of those things. She had all of those things. She had the garden, which came back every spring with the sunflowers and the tomatoes and the beans and the corn, faithful and regular as any promise she had ever been made. She had the school, which Clara had made into something larger than a school, and William attended with the systematic curiosity of a boy who intended to know everything, and Alice would attend in 3 years when she was ready. She had the locked door on the front of the 4-room cabin on 120 acres of red rock and good grass and creek water, in the Arizona territory that she had arrived in on the run and had stayed in by choice. She had Joseph Donnelly, who had ridden 12 miles in the dark for a child he had never met, who had sat through the long hours of a fever night when he could have gone, who had looked at her in the lamplight and told her the truth without angle or motive, who had kissed her beside a corral fence in the May light and loved her steadily and completely through every ordinary and extraordinary thing that had followed. She had Clara, who was brilliant and brave and still slept with Miss Penny on the far left side of the shelf, who would go to California for school and come back different and more fully herself, which was how it was meant to be. She had William, who knew the name of every cloud formation he had ever seen and who would grow up to be the kind of man who asked questions and listened to the answers. She had Alice, 6 weeks old, sleeping in an Irish rocking chair in the December light, who had not yet decided what she would be but who had already demonstrated a certainty of self that suggested it would be considerable. "It's a good life," she said. Joseph turned his face into her hair and said, "It is." Outside, the Arizona desert held its own particular winter quiet under the enormous sky, and the creek ran over red and brown stones in the dark, and in the morning the sun would come up on the 120 acres, and the cabin and the garden and the horses in the corral and the chickens in their house, and all of it would be exactly where it was supposed to be, exactly as solid and real and enduring as it had been the day before, and the day before that. All the way back to the first morning after the long dark fever night when a man with gray-green eyes had looked at a small, burning child and had chosen, simply, not to leave. Helen Easton Donnelly pressed her hand over her husband's on her shoulder and felt, with the full clarity of something finally, completely, and permanently settled, that she was home. Outside, the stars were enormous over the desert, and the night was cold and clear, and the fire in the wood stove burned warm and certain in the 4-room cabin on the 120 acres west of Dusty Creek, and there was nowhere else to go, and no reason to run, and the dawn would come tomorrow the same way it had come every morning since, the way it had come on the one particular morning she had watched for it most desperately. Pressing through the windows of a back room in a saloon while her daughter's fever broke and a stranger sat still in a chair and refused to leave until the light came. It had always been coming. She knew that now. She had just needed to stay still long enough to let it find her. She stayed.